Well, good morning. It's wonderful to be with you this morning. Glad for your presence. Glad everyone is here this morning, that they were safe from the storms last night. Hopefully no one got any damage, but nonetheless, I am grateful that we're all here together this morning, able to worship our God together. And hopefully we'll look at the lesson together that's prepared, and we'll try to glean some things that we might be able to think about, and consider some things maybe we haven't considered before. We all know that there is a difference between reading a passage, reading a story in Scripture, and understanding it. In Luke chapter 10, in verse 25, it says, "And behold, a certain loyalist stood up and tested him, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' And he said to him, 'What is written in the law? What is your reading of it?'" So is Jesus saying, how do you understand the law? What is your interpretation? How do you read this? What does it mean to you? You tell me, and then I'll explain, which is what Jesus does. And then, of course, he goes into the parable of the Good Samaritan to teach. So the question is not just about the reading, though. It's about understanding and then applying. And I want to take a look at how we can apply a story such as the book of Esther, which we're going to be taking a look at this morning. Ago, in our Sunday morning Bible class, when we were talking about happiness, we had talked about the providence of God, and I brought the story of Esther to kind of talk about God's providence. It's really one of my favorite books in Scripture. I love this story. It is one that was told to me often growing up, and it does mean a whole lot when you're looking for God's hand in things. And it teaches us a lot about God's providence and faith and courage that is in this book. But when I was doing that study of Esther in that Bible class, I came across this point of view this morning of different ways you could read the book of Esther. And so this morning I want to take a look at what the events, and we'll go over what the book of Esther is all about, and then we'll take a look at those different ways that we can read and interpret the events that happening in the book of Esther. I hope that will be something that will be interesting and something that we can get a lot out of. So the book of Esther is one of two books in the Bible that was named after a woman, the other being Ruth. And unlike Ruth in her story, Esther becomes queen of a foreign land. Now the book is written after the exile, after the time where the Babylonians had come into the land of Judah, took its people, all the important bloodlines, the royal bloodline and the high-standing people, back to Babylon, and they kept them there in captivity. And then the Babylonians were taken over by the Medes and the Persians. And when the Emperor Cyrus came into power, he allowed the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem and inhabit their land once again so they could rebuild, as it talks about in Ezra and Nehemiah. And so now we have an Esther, but not all the Jews went back to their homeland. Some of them stayed. Some of them were scattered throughout the land of the Medo-Persian Empire, the land that used to be Babylon. And that's where the Jews many Jews are settled during this time, all throughout the land of the Medes and the Persians. And so, even though the Jews had opportunity to return to Jerusalem, some stayed behind. They just they chose to do that. And Esther and Mordecai were one of those two who had chosen to stay. And Esther was her parents. We're not exactly sure what happened to him, but we know that Mordecai, her cousin, was the one that raised Esther, became her father figure and raised her as his own. And it's also interesting to note that God's name is never mentioned in the book of Esther. Nowhere in the book do we see that the God's name is explicitly named. However, we see his influence and providence all throughout the story. As it says in, the example, Mordecai tells Esther in Esther chapter 4 and verse 14, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this, that she was placed in a certain role at a certain time that she would be able to help her people and save her people. And we'll talk about that in the moment. And also, this is the origin of one of the Jewish feasts of Purim. And Purim is a Jewish festival established all the way in Esther's time, and it celebrates the Jews' deliverance from destruction. And Purim is still observed today by those who still follow Judaism. And so those were one among the major feasts that the Jews observe every single year. And so we'll get into the story of Esther here. In chapter 1, we see that the land is ruled by Ahasuerus. This is also King Xerxes, also known by Ahasuerus. But the king is throwing this lavish feast. He's throwing a big banquet, and he invites all the princes of the provinces and all the area to come, and they're feasting, they're eating, and they're drinking, and they're being merry, and they become drunk with wine. And the princess requests that the king should bring out the king's bride, the queen, that they could look and that she could be passed around, basically. And that she could be ogled after. And this did not sit right with the queen. Queen Vashti did not like this whatsoever, and she refused to come and be an object of the eyes of the people that were present. And because of this, all the princes in the area advised the king that she is not a submissive wife, she is not used to you, you should dismiss her and banish her from the kingdom. And that's exactly what happened. King Ahasuerus banished Vashti, divorced her, and dismissed her out of his household. Also in this, the royal advisors feared that if Vashti's disobedience goes unpunished, that it would also encourage their wives as well to defy their husbands in this way. So this leads to the search of a new queen. And so there is a decree that goes on to the land that all the eligible women, all the virgins of the kingdom would be come together, would be lined up basically in front of the king, and he would be able to choose his next wife. And so Mordecai puts forth Esther as one of those women. She puts herself forth by Mordecai's urging, and Mordecai also counseled her, now when you go before, tell nobody that you're Jewish. Keep that to yourself. And so she does that thing, and she hides her Jewish identity on Mordecai's advice. And so she goes into this basically a beauty pageant where she is prepared over a series of a year, being adorned with perfumes and oils and all of these things to make them lavish and pleasing for the king. This whole process, and while they were in the house of virgins, they ate the meals that were unkosher to the Jewish people, and so Esther eats the king's food. And so through all of this, she's chosen to go from the house of virgin to the house of concubines. And when she comes before the king loves her more than anybody else. She's the most beautiful, she's the most appealing, and he chooses her among all of the women in the entire kingdom. We're not told exactly how many that was, but we know that there were many that were kept. And so Esther was chosen among all those people to be king and be queen. And queen she became. And as the verse that was just read in our hearing, the king loved Esther more than any other woman. She obtained grace and favor in his sight, more than, verse 17 of chapter 2, of all the virgins. And so they set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. The king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. Now, shortly after this, Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate, as he normally does. He's one of the watchers there. And as he's sitting, he overhears a plot to kill the king. Well, Mordecai has a connection with Esther, of course, that they're cousins. And so he, through that connection, lets the plot be known that the king's life was in danger. And so this plot was thwarted, and Mordecai's efforts was written in the King's Chronicles. And that will come to fruition later in the story. And so as Mordecai stands at the gates like he normally does, there is a certain man that was promoted in the king's court by the name of Haman. In chapter 3 and verse 1 said, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him to this, and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not pay homage. He wouldn't bow like the rest of the men who were at the king's gate, who did and paid homage because that was the king's command, but Mordecai wouldn't. He was Jew, and he was a Jew, and he would only bow to God. And this was known that Mordecai was a Jewish. He made those things plainly. And Haman hated Mordecai because of this. And so Haman developed a plot. He brought himself before the king and said, "O king, in your land there is a dispersed people all through your kingdom. And they don't obey your laws. They don't recognize you as a supreme authority. And they could uprise against you. We would be better off killing them all." And Haman devised a way that they would be slaughtered through the Jewish people would be killed and got rid of, and through the law. And the way that Haman explained this to the king allowed. And he set this into a law at a certain day. And Haman also offered that he would pay a great sum for these men who would come and kill the Jews. And, and so when something is codified into law, under the empire of the Medes and the Persians, there was no way to reverse it. Not even the king himself could take back a law once it was told. And so when Mordecai finds out about the destruction of the Jews that was codified in the law, he rents his garments. He cries. He exclaims in pain. As it says in chapter 4, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and cried out loud in a bitter cry. And he went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, which was fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So the queen's handmaidens see that Mordecai, and they know that they're sees that the eunuchs came and told Esther, as it says in verse 4, so Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her that the queen was deeply distressed. And she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, to take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend to her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this is. So Hathach went to Mordecai in the city square and was front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened, that the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. And he also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain to her, that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead before her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. And Esther spoke to, it says in verse 10, then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a can for Mordecai. Because all the king's servants and the people of the king's promises know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king, who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death, except the one whom the king holds the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go to the king for 30 days. She fears for her life. If I go and petition on your behalf, on our people's behalf, my life could be in danger. But look what Mordecai tells her in verse 13. He said, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than any other Jews. Do you think when you're found out to be Jewish, do you think you'll be safe? Just because you are the king's queen? We already have seen that he's willing to dispose of his first queen. Why not wouldn't you be the same way? He said, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to this kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to go to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days and night or day. And my maids and I will fast likewise, and I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. So Esther spends these 3 days fasting, asks the Jews and the people of the city to pray and fast with her, and so she prepares herself for 3 days. So she adorns herself, she makes herself pretty, she prepares herself to go and forth the king, and she enters his chamber, enters the throne room. And the king looks at her. Now here's the moment that she could lose her life. But thankfully, her sight pleased the king, and he extended his royal scepter. So she came to him and touched it. And he said, what request do you have, my wife? Anything that you have, I will give you. And she said, I want a feast. I want a banquet in your name. So in verse 4, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. And the king said, bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done. Then Esther answered and said, my petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. And so she makes another banquet for the next day to honor him and Haman just thinks the world of this. Oh, wow. The queen is inviting me to a banquet with her. The king, I must be doing great things. I must be going to get a great reward. And so when Haman went back out into the city, he saw Mordecai again, and it just caused him so much anger because Mordecai wouldn't bow to him. And so Haman created gallows just for Mordecai. When these men come and kill all the Jews, gallows will be for Mordecai. And he makes them special just for him. Now this night, the king couldn't sleep. He had a lot of troubling dreams, and so as he stood up, he started to read the King's Chronicles to see if that would put him to sleep. And he comes across this man Mordecai, They had done him a great service, had saved his life. And so he asks his advisors, what has been done for this man? They said, well, nothing yet. So the king says to himself, well, bring Haman before me. And Haman comes before the king, and he says to Haman, what should I do for a man that should be honored for a great service to the kingdom? Now Haman thinks he's talking about him. And so he says, you should adorn him. Let him hold the king's scepter, adorn him in fine raiment, and parade him around the city on the king's horse, and show that all around this great person has done you a great service in your kingdom. And the king says, great, do this for Mordecai. And so Haman, who hates Mordecai with all of his being, wants to kill him, creates gallows for him that he could be killed, has to do this for Mordecai and parade him around the city. But Haman is not, he doesn't like this aspect at all, doesn't like this one bit, but he still thinks he is going to be lauded, he is going to be rewarded by the queen herself, and looks forward to this dinner. So finally they come to this banquet. And Esther inquires about the destruction of the Jews. And she says very bravely, reveals her identity as a Jew, and said, let me be the first to die, for I am a Jew. And she finally reveals her Jewish identity, and he exposes Haman's plan. Explains why he wanted to do it in the first place. He devised this just because of his vendetta against one man. And the king is enraged. And he orders Haman's execution by the same gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Now there's still a problem, though. The order to kill the Jews was law. There was nothing that could be done. So the king decided that he would write an amendment to the law, an addendum, that on that day when the Jews would be exterminated, they would be allowed to defend themselves. They would be armed and allowed to defend themselves. And the Jews were victorious that day. No Jew died that day. And because of this, the Jews are victorious, and the Feast of Purim is established as a celebration of their survival. And so Esther is put specifically in the perfect place, in the perfect spot, that she can save her entire kingdom. And we can see, even though God's name is not named, we see that God's hand was in that. She was in the right place in the right time in order to save her people. What a glorious story that is. Now, there are a few different ways that you can interpret the story of Esther. One of those ways is probably the way that is most common. Probably the way that you've heard it and that I've heard it. It's more in a way of like a Cinderella story, a Cinderella reading, simplistic in a traditional interpretation. Esther is seen as a beautiful woman, chosen above all the king, and becomes queen like a fairy tale. And that she was able to save her people through the events of becoming queen. However, just viewing it from that viewpoint kind of ignores some difficult passages and difficult events that happen in the story. First of all, Esther lives in a foreign land under pagan rule. She chose to stay behind. She chose not to go back with her people in Mordecai. She hides her identity instead of openly proclaiming her faith. And as if you read the details of chapter 2, you'll see how she was prepared to be with the king. Over this year, she is prepared physically, beautified with oils, perfumes, so that she would be the most attractive as well as all the other women, to be paraded before the king. And when she was in the house of the virgins, she was chosen to go into the house of the concubines. And all of these concubines that were in that house had to spend a night with the king. And so she spends a night with the king before becoming queen. And so there are some things that happen that aren't so Cinderella-like. Though nonetheless, if we just pick certain highlights of the story, we can read it from that perspective. There's also sort of the Bachelor reading, based off the show The Bachelor. And I've never really been a fan of that show, but it always kind of seems that one of the goals of that show is just the promiscuous nature of the whole thing, not really to end up with love. But this kind of reading focuses on Esther's ambition of the whole affair rather than the latter. It suggests that she kind of compromised her morals to gain power. So there's some points of criticism from this point of view of reading it, that she keeps her Jewish identity a secret instead of standing up for her faith. She doesn't eat kosher food, unlike when Daniel was before the king in his story. He didn't eat the king's food, but she did. And she marries a foreigner, which is against Jewish law. And so she is put forth. By Mordecai, her and Mordecai both put her forth that she had this desire to become queen. Did this mean that Esther was wrong? Or did God use an imperfect situation for his perfect will? That's up to the interpretation of the reader from that point of view. There's also the Me Too. The preacher who I heard talk about this, he was reading and writing during the time that the Me Too movement was getting traction. And this view it was talking about lots of women coming forth and professing that they had been abused at some time in their life. A man had taken advantage of them. But see, this view, Esther is the victim of the system. That King Xerxes forces the young women in this area into this kind of harem. That she doesn't really have a choice in the matter. When she's chosen, she doesn't have little choice to become queen. And so this reading sort of highlights there is an abuse of power by the king. And more of the reality of understanding that Esther had no control over her situation. And the courage she shows, even though she's put in this position, while navigating a difficult position, is shown paramountly. Despite her circumstances, she remains faithful to her people. She remains faithful to God and trusts in God's providence. And she lets her circumstance guide the salvation of her people. So all of these versions have their strengths and their weaknesses. What can we learn from Esther? God's providence is at work even when he seems absent for our lives. Sometimes God's presence isn't plainly seen, or if someone is looking for it in the wrong places, by maybe a misunderstanding of God's will and how God works. God's name is never mentioned in this story, but his hand is seen in every single event that happened. And even when we don't see or hear of God's voice, he's still working. If we're truly looking, we're truly seeking him and searching for him, we're going to find it. It may not be in the way that we wanted it. It may not be in the way that we asked for it or expected it, but God will come through in his time. To have such courage as Esther involves sometimes taking risks. Esther risked her life in order to to come with this plan to save her people. She could have been killed right off when she came before the king in that 30 days that she had not seen him. Sometimes God calls us to step out in faith, even when it could be dangerous for us. God can use imperfect situations to his ultimate glory. Even though Esther may have not seemed like a perfect example of Jewish faithfulness, God used her position to ultimately save her people. So even when we fall short, even when we seem to fall short of the grace of God and stumble and fall away from God, God can still use us for his purposes if we allow him to. There's a time to speak and a time to be silent. Mordecai tells Esther to keep her identity secret at first, but later urges her to speak up. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 7 says, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. And wisdom is knowing when to act, when to speak up, when the Christian walk just requires us to stand up for our faith, to stand up for God. And so in this story, there are several readings that we could, and understandings that we could bring from this. But hopefully with study and with time, we can always glean the proper one and glean the one that God intended for us to glean. I hope this lesson has been informative. I hope it's been interesting for you this morning. I hope that we'll all try to study Scripture more and find new ways of trying to look at these situations, try to understand the perspectives of the people at the time that will encourage us, increase our knowledge, and so we can just understand and be able to share that with others more ably. If there's anyone here this morning who is subject to the Lord's invitation in any way, whether it's become a Christian or there's something in your life that you want the prayers and the encouragement of your brothers and sisters this morning, let us pray for you. Let us help you in any way that we can. Whatever your need is, you can make those things known now as we stand and as we sing.